It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Rupert Callender to our Completed Life Initiative Fall Conference. Rupert has been called the best funeral director of all time by a country mile, but I suspect you might quibble with the title, funeral director, but we'll discuss that point of clarification. But being the best at anything is to be commended. So we commend you, Rupert, for that. One reviewer said about Rupert's book, What Remains, Life, Death, and the Human Art of Undertaking is You'll Be Changed. It's an instant classic. It's a summary of a book, Rupert, to which I would agree. It changed me. It feels like a classic. So welcome. We're delighted that you are part of our fall conference.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be invited, and those are two kind things to say. Thank you so much.
Well, we're delighted that you are here, delighted to have this conversation. So I'd like to begin with a lovely and ancient word, and that is vocation, the roots of which go back to this Latin word, vocare, that means calling. And in your book, you helpfully frame your work in terms of that language, vocation, calling in many ways. And you write this: I have created a job that fills my soul, which means I can sleep at night knowing that I'm doing the right thing, and which gives me a living. And this calling, you further explain, is reinventing how people experience death and funerals through applying the lessons of punk, acid house, maybe topping the anarchist movement, which you helpfully clarify is not advocating for no rules, but no rulers, like the funeral industry. Can you share with our audience how you came to discern this vocation, your calling?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I had been waiting for a vocation, and I now you've said that to me and reread back to me what I've written and described the roots of the word vocation. I'm very aware of the kind of religious undertones to it, really. And when I was a child and was raised as a Protestant in Scotland, I did have sort of religious yearnings. So I think yes, I was definitely waiting for something that I thought my life was meant to be about. And as I describe in the book, I'd experienced a lot of bereavement as a child and a young adult, and I'd either been excluded from the funerals that were happening, or the funerals that I'd been to had been very unsatisfactory. So I was watching television one afternoon, late afternoon, I should add. But there were, at that stage of my life, I probably was watching television in the afternoon. I was 29 and a bit lost, really. And I saw someone on the television, a man called Nicholas Albury, who started a charity called the Natural Death Centre, with the idea of trying to recreate for the funeral industry what the kind of hippie home birth movement had done for hospital births. And he was describing how in the UK, I know it's different in the US, but in the UK, you don't need a license to practice as an undertaker or any training, because in fact in the UK, as a family who is going through a bereavement, you don't necessarily need to hire an undertaker. You can do it all yourself. So he's written a book, a kind of manual called the Natural Death Handbook, which laid out the very practical ways that a family could do a funeral themselves. And it was a real Damascene moment for me. And my mother had died a few years earlier, and my father had died when I was 7. And my mother's funeral was very traditional and in a church in the village in which she lived. Um, but she was an atheist, there was a little bit of a contradiction about her having it in the church. But she was kind of culturally part of the church's life in the village. Um, so and that funeral had made me that death in particular had made me realize that I had a great deal of unresolved grief stretching back to my childhood. So discovering that you didn't need any qualifications to set up as an undertaker made me instantly realize I wanted to be one. And it hadn't crossed my mind in any shape or form before that this was something that I was going to be doing. But it really was a moment of inspiration when I thought, this is what I can do with my life. So it sort of arrived fully formed, as it were, and I haven't really deviated from that initial moment of inspiration for 24 years now.
That's really helpful. And again, I so appreciated your description of that journey in your book. And I suspect we share a common appreciation of Thomas Lynch, a writer, a
Absolutely.
fellow person in the same trade who has written lovely books and thoughtful books about being a funeral director or undertaker. And he once made this observation. He said, the hole we open to bury our dead, a grave, shares the same root word in all the ancient etymologies, and that is a grave is linked with gravitas and even gravity. And you have been there beside that hole, in that place of gravitas and gravity. And you write in your book, I've done funerals on beaches, cliff tops, pubs, village halls, woods at twilight, hilltops at dawn. I've held stillborn babies in the palm of my hand. I've looked into the eyes of dying men who know that the next time we meet, they will be dead. I've watched as children have fired flaming arrows at a pyre upon which sits their father's remains. Is there a funeral, a story of gravitas and gravity that you might want to share with our audience?
I think every funeral really that I, not necessarily because of me, but because of the circumstance of allowing families to have this space is filled with gravitas. I mean, the cliff top one only happened last year, um, and it was a woman who died, and it was her husband who was organising it, and he said that he wanted to have the funeral. It was going to be a cremation, but he said he wanted to have the ceremony in a place that was very special to them. And he said, we have an organisation in the UK called the National Trust, which looks after historical houses and for the upkeep and maintains them, and you can visit them. And he said it was at a National Trust property. So I'd assumed that it was a big house somewhere. And when we started to talk about it a little further, he said, no, it's on the land of this property. And it did turn out to be on the top of a cliff, on the sort of Somerset border, overlooking the Bristol Channel, looking out to Wales. And to get there was a steep climb of a kind of zigzagging path, which is the coastal path, which is quite a well-known way of traveling the coast of Britain. And it was about 1.5 miles from the car. And the woman who had died was in a cardboard coffin with rope handles, which are load bearing. But it was quite a journey. And I suppose we climbed probably probably maybe 150 meters to this over an hour and a half, passing rather startled hikers who the last thing they expected to see was a coffin being processed up this path. But as so often when you step out of the kind of framework of the rigid traditional funeral, the actual journey, the carrying of the coffin, became an enormous part of the ritual, and it was something that we had to do together, because the way that I practice my trade is we don't employ professional coffin carriers or bearers, as we call them here. So the family have to do it themselves. So from the moment we started, what was, in some ways quite a practical thing of getting this woman's body up to the very edge of the cliff where Exmoor drops down into the sea. There was probably about 30 people there at the funeral, and this incredible atmosphere just kind of fell over everybody. It felt like a pilgrimage. And of course, we stopped often. We've got wooden trestles which we rested the coffin on, and people swapped to carry for a little bit. And we sort of had a thermos of tea that we shared out. And it took about an hour and a half to get her up to the top of the cliff. So by the time we arrived, everybody felt profoundly in ritual space. And to look out, being able to see for miles and miles across the sea, and Wales was probably about 30 miles in the distance on the horizon, and to place this woman in their favourite spot and to perform the funeral ceremony around her was just extraordinary. Actually, it was, and it's the way I feel about a lot of the funerals we do, is deeply honoured to be invited into these incredibly intimate, delicate moments of people's lives, and share it with them, and not take it over, but create something with them that works for them. And I think there's the mainstream funeral industry would probably have balked at carrying a coffin a mile and a half up a cliff path, and certainly a cardboard coffin. They would have worried about the handles and all the things that could go wrong. But if you just kind of trust in you share out the responsibility, the practical responsibility and the emotional responsibility with people, and they realize that you're not a gatekeeper to this experience, you're a facilitator to enable them to do what they need, it becomes something incredibly profound. So that was absolutely a beautiful, beautiful service. And then we stayed up on the cliff for about an hour and a half, and then carried her back down, which was equally difficult practically in some ways. But by then we had kind of bonded as a group, and carried her back down the hill into the car, and then we went to the crematorium at the end of the day. So yes, every funeral, I hope, is filled with the gravitas. It's, if you're sincere and practice it in this way, which is a communal event rather than a performance, it becomes something so moving. And as I say, it's such an honor to be part of people's lives in these moments.
That's really helpful. And I like how you bring up the concept of a pilgrimage, which means there's a journey ahead. And I think what's particularly inspiring about your work is you offer an alternative model to what most people experience, which means there's a funeral director, a funeral home, perhaps someone in a faith tradition that in many ways doesn't offer a pilgrimage, but a series of practiced steps. There's not a lot of room for improvisation. There's not a lot of space in many ways for a family to make that service their own, but you offer a different model, I know, and I know you've written, we follow where people lead us. You give them time to shape their own service, to make that journey their own. Can you say a little bit about that? What distinguishes you from, say, what someone who has a loved one died might typically experience towards your approach to things?
I always felt when I went to funerals where there was a lot of pomp and ceremony, that you were on the back foot as the family. You didn't feel that you had control. You felt that these people were in control, and they were going to tell you what to do. So I dress as I dress now. I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and sometimes I'll put on a shirt. But our initial meeting with families um, isn't in the kind of traditional British funeral uniform, which is pinstripe trousers and a suit jacket and an expression of mock solemnity. I want people to know that we are normal and that when something awful happens, the awful, mundane, everyday horror of somebody you love dying, which is still boggles my mind that it happens to all of us. A family doesn't need it to be any weirder. So we just meet them and go, there's just us. You're not going to be handed on to someone else. The person who goes and collects the body of the person who's died is us. The person who will deal with you all the way throughout, however long it takes, and we deliberately take longer than most funeral directors. Largely around about 2 weeks, but sometimes a month. Particularly post-COVID, funerals, the time of funerals have got longer. So we don't have a kind of patter as such. I don't have a professional persona. My persona is exactly the same at work as at home. I just probably am more attentive at work. Um, so our conversation with the family isn't going to be. I'm not going to say I'm sorry for your loss and look really upset. I'm going to be very mindful of how people are, but I'm just going to try to be normal. And we just sit down and talk. And mainly, the first question I ask is, what happened? And that can be as specific as how did this person die, to what has happened in all of your lives and in all of their lives. So we just kind of start a conversation rather than showing a brochure of coffins or floral displays or talking about different options for cars and hearses and things like that. So we just try and set people at ease and make them realize that there is no hierarchy. And I'd like to point out that while I say I'm not sort of in control of things, I very much accept that the buck stops with me, and that if anything goes wrong, it's us. So there are elements to it, of course, which we control, but I hope that we do it very lightly and very gently. And some people come to me with a fully formed idea of what they want to happen, and others might have got in touch because their mother's died, and in her wishes she said she wanted a cardboard coffin, and they might Google, local cardboard coffins, and I come up, and that's how they meet us. So they might not have any idea of my ethos, or my way of practicing things. So we at some point we say, well, look, what has to happen is this person either has to be cremated or be buried, and there's a certain amount of legal paperwork that has to be constructed to get us there. But all the rest of it is entirely up to you, how you want to honor this life. So once you kind of lay that out to people, their creativity is incredible to see. And in some ways, the most satisfying funerals have been families who have just come to us because it's a natural burial or a cardboard coffin, but have no other idea about how to do it. And once they realise that they don't, there doesn't have to be a priest saying a particular formula of words. There doesn't have to be an order of how we do it. People's creativity is just amazing. And I think those are the most satisfying funerals. But really, it's just that thing of going, yeah, there is only us. So on a very, very practical level, the carrying of the coffin, we need your help. And that kind of sets the tone for people going, oh, okay, this is a shared event. This isn't a performance that we're going to witness. This is something we're going to do, something we're going to create together. And it's an incredibly simple concept, really. And as I say, it all arrived to me as soon as I discovered that this was a possibility. I knew how I was going to do it. And in many ways, it was the opposite of how I'd seen it done.
I think that's really helpful. And as you describe it, and in your book, you also explain another difference is those of us who've been to funerals, what we might encounter is someone in a faith tradition tries to summarize a life. It often becomes a litany of their success stories or their family. But I appreciate how you often try to go a little bit deeper and try to capture the true essence of someone, and you see yourself as that voice of the family. And you try to find not only their triumphs, but perhaps their setbacks. And you found that to be very meaningful for people. Could you tell us a little bit of that role that you play in the service?
My ultimate aim is to show the family that they have revealed something about their relationship with the dead person that they haven't specifically said. And that's why taking a longer time to get to the funeral and spending more time with the funeral than a conventional celebrant would is so helpful, because it might be the third or fourth meeting where they kind of let slip something about the person's childhood, which just kind of makes everything else clunk into place. And I'm going, oh, okay, I kind of understand that. And I can see why they did this and did that. So it's about, and it is about trying to share people's faults as well in as gentle and unjudgmental way as possible. But once you do that, rather than doing this kind of glorified hagiography of someone in which everything they did was happy and everything they undertook they pulled off. Once you actually kind of talk about the edges of someone's personality, the people who are present, visibly sit up and go, oh, yeah, that's a recognizable person, and that's how they were. And there's something deeply honoring. Again, I use that word a lot, but it is honoring in unfolding a life in front of people in the presence of the body of that life, that is true and real and forgiving and understanding and hopefully a bit funny and a bit sad. And also it makes everyone there think about themselves. I think this is what the church used to do very well. Is a funeral is not just about the death of the person who is in the coffin, but a good funeral should be about the death and the life of everybody.
That reminds me of a part in your book where you express some exasperation with how people say that someone has passed or we're having a celebration of life. And it feels like you have set aside those cliches.
Yeah, I do. I do rail against some of the language that is used around death and dying, particularly passed away, which is absolutely commonplace in the UK. They will say that somebody's passed away on the national news, and I think it's a little bit disingenuous, really. It's you know, I like to say that somebody has died. I think the clarity of, particularly when there are children involved who are struggling to understand what's going on, euphemisms are really unhelpful. And loved one is another one, because as I say in the book, as we know, not everybody is loved. There are some very difficult and damaged people who also die, who deserve a funeral, and they deserve to be seen in their entirety. And to call someone who was, say, a violent alcoholic, to describe them as your loved one to their children who lived through that trauma, you very quickly learn that that's a bad thing to do. But how we talk around death is hugely important. So I try to be as clear and honest around the language of it as possible, particularly with children, because I think if well-meaning parents say to their children that grandpa has gone to heaven or gone somewhere else or gone up into the clouds or fallen asleep is another one. They're really well-meaning, but they're terribly, terribly unhelpful, because a child can be quite literal. And if you tell them that grandpa's fallen asleep and he's not coming back, they can end up with an insomnia because they're afraid of falling asleep. So yeah, I think just trying to keep it clear and clean is my aim.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about the importance of rituals. You write, the rituals that I perform try to make sense of this maelstrom of grief that I work and live. I try to give people the tools for ritual. I found that interesting, and I think maybe helpful for our audience is to open up again a word that some of us may not think about that often, like vocation or rituals in the same realm. I think, are there rituals that you have found helpful? I was struck by a moment, maybe you can explain in Sharpham Meadow, you created a special burial place there, and you write about there's a central fire pit there. And you said the fire became a focal point for rituals around release and transformation.
The fire at Sharper Meadow, which is on a beautiful hilltop looking out over a tidal estuary going down to the sea. It's an exquisite space. But when we set it up with the Sharpham Trust, I was very aware that of all the natural burial sites I'd been to, and I'd been to a great number of them, none of them had what seemed to me a really obvious thing, which is a place to have a fire. Because that act of gathering round a fire and gazing into the flames is so profound and so universal that it just struck me as really obvious. So we worked out what the geographical centre of the field was, and we cut out, we drew a circle, we put a stick in the ground with a bit of rope, we drew a wide circle and cut the turf out. And for the opening of the burial ground, we did it on the summer solstice, and we lit a fire. And we made sure there was always a big supply of well-cured wood ready to go, and just offered this up for people who were having funerals there. And whenever you want, you can come and light a fire. And it kind of, the importance of the fire took a while for people to kind of really run with it. But then now it's a central feature of the burial ground, and there's probably well over 300 people buried up there. And when I go up there, there's almost probably 4 out of the 5 times I go up there, there's somebody sitting around the fire quietly.
And I think what you are describing and might be helpful for our audience to hear, because they might have heard this phrase, is a green burial or a green
Yeah.
funeral. Could you explain that to us for those of us who may not know what that is exactly?
You know, our funeral practices are broadly similar, but have some quite profound differences in the UK and the US. In the UK, we call our coffins coffins. In the US, you call them caskets, and your caskets are much sturdier. They're quite ornate, and they're kind of engineered things. And there is in some parts of the States the practice of kind of burying people in kind of concrete lined vaults. Now that doesn't happen in the UK. People are always buried directly into the ground, but they're buried at 6 foot deep, and they used to be buried until the natural death movement unpicked the legality of it. They used to be buried in churchyards and then municipal cemeteries. And then the natural death centre and people involved with it discovered that that wasn't a legal requirement, and that actually in the UK you could be buried on private land. You didn't need any kind of permission from the authorities. You had to fulfill certain criteria, certain commonplace environmental criteria. You have to be 30 meters away from running water, and you have to be 100 meters away from a borehole where any kind of water is extracted for drinking, anything like that. But other than that, if you own the land, or if you have landowners' permission, it's entirely possible to be buried in private land. So I've buried hundreds of people on their own on their own fields and in orchards and things like that. But the idea of natural burial is that you bury somebody unembalmed. I don't embalm. I never have embalmed. You bury them, if possible, wearing natural fibres, and you use a coffin that is going to biodegrade. So mainly we use woven willow or cardboard. I have a funeral on Saturday, which is just with a shroud in a natural burial ground. And at Sharper Meadow, we very much don't bury 6 foot deep. I think the graves are probably about 3.5 foot deep. So if you bury somebody 6 foot deep in a hermetically sealed coffin, then they're not going to biodegrade. But the idea behind natural burials is to have the body return to the earth as quickly and as harmlessly as possible. So natural burial grounds, and there is a Green Burial Council in the States who I've been in touch with over the years. We're kind of comrades. There is a comrade movement in the States, but it's quite big in the UK. I think there's probably about 300 natural burial sites. And the idea is that it's kinder for the environment. You're not creating a kind of necessarily a space which is solely for the burial of the dead. It can be used for all sorts of things, even if it's just a pleasant place to walk through. And it protects the land from potential development, and it allows the operator to grow trees or to create grassland or wildflower meadows or all sorts of things like that. So there's various variations of them. Some of them are in woods. I'm very lucky here in Totnes that I have a number of natural burial sites within sort of 10 miles. There's Sharper Meadow, owned and run by the Sharpham Trust, who are a charity, and that's on a hillside, and that is managed as a wild grass meadow and a refuge for all the birds of prey and the mice and hares and all the things which are struggling in the UK countryside. But I also have another one which is a higgledy-piggledy wood, and the range of them is vast, but the overarching idea is that you are burying somebody in a way that does not harm the earth, and is as kind to their body as possible, and has a positive environmental impact on the wider countryside.
Your description, I think, is it's helpful for our audience, and perhaps they've heard that term but didn't quite know what that meant. And it makes me think we talked about the journey that you help people to embark on as a pilgrimage. And I wanted to take us back to maybe where that pilgrimage begins for a moment, because I thought you said some very powerful things, just describing the moment when someone dies. You have this phrase, there's the presence of their absence and the absence of their presence. And there's something that happens at that moment. And I thought it was also powerful where you said, dying isn't something that happens to you. It's something that you do. For our audience who may not have had the privilege or the opportunity to be there when someone dies, could you describe what that's been like and help us to get a better understanding of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I myself haven't had the privilege of being present when somebody dies, um, but I have been in the immediate aftermath of it, and it is an extraordinary moment. It strikes me every time I go through a bereavement, uh, and I'm sure it happens to everybody, that you are absolutely struck by how bizarrely personal and isolating the experience is, but at the same time you realize this is a universal thing, this is a universal part of being alive, and it really does, it causes you to realize that we're on a fulcrum. Our existence is so, the odds against our existence is so extraordinary, and then when somebody dies, the idea that they've gone is also equally unfathomable, really. And so I still find it mind-boggling. I still find it mind-boggling that somebody who can be so vital and so present then can be physically the vessel that they walked around this world in can be physically there for a bit, but they're not responding. It's such a catch-22, really, that it gets me every time. But I just think that there is, I believe, as I'm sure you probably do too, Mark, that in our dying there is something about, something profound about the whole of our lives, that it's as important as birth, and that it is something that can be approached consciously, rather than, as so many people do, understandably so, trying to keep the idea of death at arm's length. That if you kind of accept that this is going to happen, you can have an extraordinary experience. I mean, I'm burying a gentleman on Saturday, the man I talked about who's been buried in a shroud, and I was talking with his son a couple of hours ago on the phone, and his son is a lovely poet and had written a number of. His father was his biggest fan, and there was a particular poem that he had written, which was about his mother's death, and his father used to make him read it at least twice a week to him. And he and his brother were gathered around his father's bed as he was dying, literally in the last hour or so of his life. And he said, "Dad, shall I read the poem?" He was thinking this is the most perfect moment for it. And his father opened his eye and said, "No, son, you're all right." And just this idea that you can still keep the kind of dynamics, the emotional dynamics of humor, and you can kind of play a practical joke on your son in the last hour of your life is just so heartening. That the ability for people to hold on to their personality, right up until that last second, and in somehow in doing so project their personality, how to sort of expel their personality into the hearts of the people who love them as they die. I just think it's an extraordinary thing. But when I say dying is something you do, not something that happens to you, um, it used to be something that was screened off, particularly by the medical profession, who in the UK, I don't know about in the US, but in the UK, maybe 30 years ago, maybe as little as time as that, you wouldn't be told if you had terminal cancer. You wouldn't necessarily be told by the doctor. Your family would be told, but it was something that you were thought you couldn't kind of cope with. And things are changing in such a way that it's all being deconstructed, which is what I've been trying to do with funerals, is trying to kind of deconstruct it so that people can see what's going on. And there is so much that people know now when they're around the bed of somebody who's dying. I mean, you know what is when somebody's dying of some kind of a condition, they've got a trajectory to their dying, and their breathing gets slower and slower. And there is what is known as the death rattle, which is basically when your muscles are all starting to shut down and your swallow mechanism has kind of shut down. And it's the phlegm and mucus in the back of your throat makes this terrible noise. And it sounds awful to the people who are sitting around the bed. It sounds like that it must be distress. It's a horrible sound to to hear someone you love making at the end of their life. But of course, to the person dying, they're beyond caring. They don't mind at all. So there are drugs that can be given to the person which stops that. And I had a palliative care doctor, say to me the other day, this is the only instance in medicine where we're giving a drug for not for the patient but for the relatives. But if you open it up and deconstruct it to people and go, yep, that sounds awful and it's quite difficult to listen to, but I promise you that it is not giving the dying person any distress at all. You're suddenly in a whole new realm of just going, okay, I understand. This is a physical process that they're doing. It is hard work. Some people just die like that, but I think for most of us, dying is a process, and it does feel like something that you have to work at. But once you understand that as the family of this person, it changes the whole experience for you. And once you go, yeah, if you've ever seen anybody giving birth, it's a grueling process, not just for the mother, but for the baby too. And once you realise that death is, of course, the mirror of birth, and that it is a thing you do, not something that happens to you, it just kind of changes your understanding of it.
Thank you for that. And where my mind went to next is I think you've been beside people in that experience, and you've also helped them after in their grieving process. And I was struck where you talked about that grief is like a boomerang, that it keeps coming around. For those in our audience who might be grieving someone in their life, is there insights that you might share into the reality of grief, or what you found is helpful to them?
I mean, the thing about grief is there is no rule book. There is no progression. Of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with the 5 stages, which people often think is about grief. And of course, it isn't actually. It's about the 5 stages you go through when you're presented with a terminal diagnosis. And I think they're disbelief, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And people have come to think that that is what is going to happen to them when they grieve. That there are steps. There is a definable moments to it. And of course, there aren't. Everybody grieves differently. I think the idea that particularly if it's a child who's died, or a husband and wife, this idea that you're going to get over it and move through it is just so unhelpful, really, because if it's your child, why would you want to get over it? Because getting over it would mean letting go of the grief, which is, of course, love in a different form, and that's the last thing they would want to do. But a useful analogy I did hear was, so people used to talk about grief, serious grief, being like a kind of giant black spot, like in your vision, that everywhere you look there is this black spot, and they used to kind of say that as time went on, the black spot would get smaller and smaller. But someone told me, they went, no, it's not like that. It's like grief is this black hole in front of you, and it's not that it'll ever go away or get smaller. It's just in the early stages, in the first few years, it's all you can see. But after a while, smaller circles of colour, as you carry on with your life and you experience moments of joy and happiness, and you forget the grief for a moment, these other spots will start to kind of superimpose themselves over that big black sphere of grief. And the black sphere of grief will always be there and will always be visible. It's just it will be added to by other life events. And I think that's the most helpful thing. Actually, there's the other most helpful thing is, and it was told to me by the same person, they just said two words, which is things change. And that idea that things change both from good to bad, bad to good, is incredibly useful when you're stuck in the worst bits of grief, where it just seems like it's never going to get better. Things change. But the idea that there's a kind of universal model or stages of being less and less upset is that's very damaging, really. I think it's kind of like death itself. Is nobody knows what it's like. Nobody knows what's waiting for us. We all have to walk that lonely valley ourselves, and grief is a similar valley that we have to walk on our own, because the experience of somebody walking right beside us isn't going to be the same as ours. It's a deeply personal thing. But I think the only thing which gives me comfort is the incredulity that we all go through this. We all die, and we probably all experience grief. But it just seems so isolating at the time. But it's at the bedrock of what it means to be human.
Very eloquently said. Thank you. And when you bring up the concept of things change, I wanted to ask, if it's all right, how this has changed you in some ways. You have this lovely paragraph where you say, I worry that I am in some way becoming transparent, that my atoms have exchanged places with the dead as I dress them and hold them, that the dead are mingling with me until I become a part of them. It makes me desperately try to understand linear time is illusion, that everything that happens is happening today. That is what I hope. The nearest I can get to is a belief in an afterlife, that some moments do last forever. I found that just a lovely and honest and vulnerable piece of writing. How has this experience changed you? How are you doing? How's linear time for you?
Well, I still hope that this idea, for me, it's the most kind of rational, scientific attempt at a kind of spiritual leap into an afterlife, is this idea that time is an illusion, and that it's not linear, and that everything that's happened in the I think Brian Eno and David Byrne did a brilliant album which was called Everything That Happened Is Happening Today, and that's my big hope, really. But it what people expect, because I've been doing this so long, is that I'm okay with death, uh, or that I have some understanding that they don't, and I'm not. okay with death. I'm still quite frightened of it. I'm still frightened of my own death. I still haven't a clue what happens after we die, if anything. Um, but it's and also people expect that I or project rather what I describe. You know, people think that I have some sort of a Ram Dass vibe. Is that, you know, it makes you spiritually elevated being around death. Um, and it hasn't me. Maybe some people it does, but it hasn't me. I'm still quite uh, outraged by the whole concept. I think I say in the book that the only thing I can think of worse than death is living forever, really. So there's such a catch there. But I've since kind of I'm very aware of the fragility of life. I'm very aware of uh, unfinished business, I suppose, and I would be scared of dying without having made amends for the any wrongs I might have done, any kind of friendships gone awry, loose ends. I'm kind of more aware of that, and also my fear of death is kind of I've realised that it's actually a fear of grief, which I think is more frightening than death, and the death of the people I love the most. Um, you know, is much more frightening than the thought of my own death, because I do know that whatever happens, it's I don't believe in a heaven or hell as such. I don't believe I'm going to be judged in some way. I don't believe that that there's something worse waiting for me. I think it's going to be all right. But I just yeah, I just I do I'm more aware of trying not to do wrong, or trying to do a little less wrong than I might do normally in life, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for my last question, and it was a perfect segue to it. You brought up the theme of unfinished business, which we've all thought about now and again, and what what our what what we try to bring up in our work is the question of what is a completed life.
Yeah,
In many ways, by raising that question, it raises the topic: are there aspects of your life that may not be complete, and what might that look like to each individual person in regards to how they want their life to end, but also how they want to live their life today, as you put it. Have you seen particular people who may have somehow embodied that they felt they had a complete life, and are there characteristics or qualities that you might have seen in the as you've led people through funerals, that might help us to think about what a complete life might look like with um, more finished business than unfinished business?
I think the title of your organisation, A Completed Life, is so brilliant, because that is the aim, as far as I see it. Really, is to complete your life, and of course, so many of us get caught up in the idea that a completed life is one in which you've ticked off a number of achievements, you know, a career, a family, all these sort of things. But I like the idea, you know, as Jung thought of as individuation, and he would talk about it in terms of, you know, of a child needing to individuate away from their parents. But I think this idea of individuation is incredibly powerful and moving, because I really see it as moving into your whole self. And I think that the wisest people I've met are the people who don't consider a completed life, you know, like a bucket list of achievements or things that they want to get done, or that they should get done, but really someone who has come to understand that there is there is no everlasting happiness, there is no necessarily no everlasting pain, that most people's lives are a blend of each, and every day is a blend of each. And it's the people who kind of move through their own lives open to the sadness and open to the joy that I found most inspirational, really. And yeah, when I mentioned Ram Dass, I would say someone like Ram Dass, I do, you know, he holds a very special place in my heart. I think he led a completed life, probably all of his life, really, from his various incarnations in this life, from his doctorship, and his kind of psychedelic radicalism, right through to his religious enlightenment. I think that is someone who had completed their life. I think he probably completed his life at the age 10. And that's what I most admire is people who aren't striving for an unreachable perfection, either a kind of moral perfection or you know some kind of financial reward or career reward, or even bringing up the perfect family, but someone who realizes that this life is it, and that it's an extraordinary mixed thing, and that to fully complete it, you are in it. You are in every moment of it, and that might be terrible, and that might be marvelous, and it was usually on alternate days. But it's interesting being an undertaker, because I really think that everybody's life is a completed life when they die, and this, for me, this is how I can manage to tell the story of the life of someone I've never met, is because as soon as somebody has died, their life is completed, and you can see it. It makes sense in a way that when somebody's alive, it doesn't really, because you know the end of the story, and it's a cruel contradiction that in some ways we'll never be able to see our own completed life. But if we live it openly and with other people, they will be able to see the gift of our completed life. But it's, I think some lives are desperately sad, through no fault of the individual, just through circumstances, and some lives seem absolutely charmed. But I look at every life as completed when it's died. A 10-year-old is a completed life. It's short, it's unfair. There's a whole load of unknown potential of things that could have happened, but we all get one shot at it, and when it's over, this life is over. So a completed life, it's almost impossible to avoid a completed life. But I love what you're doing, and I love the idea that we have one shot at creating our personalities. And I'm not sure that I believe in the kind of spiritual idea of a soul, but I love the idea of a soul as a metaphor, and I do talk about a soul. And I think that our life's work is to fashion our personalities, to fully inhabit our personalities before we die. And some people don't. Some people, for various reasons, hide all sorts of aspects of themselves, or are frightened of aspects of themselves. But the most admirable people are the ones who live themselves fully in all their faults and all their flaws. It's why I'm comfortable talking about somebody's flaws, because I don't necessarily see them as flaws. Though obviously we all have them. I have thousands of flaws, and I also have. If I was to die today, I have unfinished business which I would regret. But I'm doing my best to live in the moment and to encourage other people to live in the moment. Realize that you are enough. What you are at the moment is enough.
Thank you, Rupert. We're grateful for this conversation, grateful for your work, grateful for your pioneering and thoughtful spirit, and can't commend enough your book, What Remains, Life, Death, and the Human Art of Understanding. I was changed when I read it. I do think it's an instant classic as well. So thank you for your time, and we are truly grateful.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm so honored to be invited, and it was such a lovely conversation. Thank you.